There is something that happens to empaths in the earliest chapters of their life that they rarely understand at the time. They feel too much, too deeply, and too often. Where others can walk away from a moment and forget it, they carry it. Where others can hear a tone and move on, they replay it in their mind again and again. It feels like a weakness in the beginning, almost like life made a mistake by making them this sensitive. But what they don't realize is that this sensitivity is not the problem. It is the beginning of something far greater being formed within them. At first, an empath does not know how to separate their own emotions from the emotions of others. They walk into a room and suddenly their mood changes without explanation. They speak to someone and leave feeling heavier, even if nothing directly happened to them. They think it is confusion, but in truth, it is perception without training. It is awareness without structure, and like any raw gift, it feels overwhelming before it becomes useful. But life has a strange way of refining those who feel deeply. Over time, the same sensitivity that once caused confusion begins to sharpen into clarity. The mind starts to notice patterns. The heart begins to recognize emotional signals that others completely miss. An empath begins to understand not just what people say, but what they are trying to hide behind their words. Tone becomes information. Silence becomes language. Energy becomes data. This is where something profound begins to unfold. What was once emotional overload slowly transforms into emotional intelligence. Not the kind that is taught in books, but the kind that is carved through experience. The empath begins to realize that people are not always honest with their words, but they are always honest with their energy. And once this truth is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen again. There comes a stage where they stop reacting to everything they feel and start observing it instead. This is a turning point. Because observation creates distance, and distance creates understanding. They no longer drown in the emotions of others. They start reading them. They begin to see when someone is speaking from pain rather than truth, when someone is projecting their insecurity rather than expressing reality. And instead of absorbing it, they learn to interpret it. What once felt like emotional chaos becomes a kind of inner map. The empath starts navigating human behavior with a precision that surprises even themselves. They can sense tension before it is spoken. They can feel dishonesty before it is revealed. And most importantly, they begin to understand their own emotional landscape with the same clarity they once reserved for others. But perhaps the most important transformation is this. They stop assuming that their sensitivity is a flaw that needs to be fixed. Instead, they begin to recognize it as a form of intelligence that simply needed maturity. Because sensitivity, when unrefined, feels like suffering. But sensitivity, when understood, becomes insight. It becomes foresight. It becomes a quiet awareness that guides them in ways logic alone never could. And so, what the world once misunderstood as fragility begins to reveal itself as depth. A depth that allows them to see beneath surfaces, beneath masks, beneath performances that most people accept as reality. They are no longer just reacting to life. They are reading it. And in that reading, they begin to find strength. This is how the transformation begins. Not with the absence of feeling, but with the mastery of it. Not by shutting the heart down, but by finally learning how to listen to it without being consumed by it. And in that awakening, they realize a truth that changes everything forever. What once overwhelmed them was never meant to break them, it was meant to reveal them. There comes a stage in the life of an empath when the world stops being gentle with their openness. It is as if life itself begins to test what they have been freely giving away. At first, they do not recognize it as a lesson. They recognize it as confusion, even pain. They give understanding and receive misunderstanding in return. They give loyalty and encounter betrayal. They give emotional presence and are met with emotional absence. And slowly, something begins to break. Not their heart in the way they fear, but their illusion that everyone operates with the same depth of care they carry within themselves. This is where pain begins its silent work, not as punishment, but as instruction. The empath by nature does not build boundaries early in life. They are open channels, receiving everything and filtering nothing. They believe love means availability, that kindness means access, that compassion means self-sacrifice. And so they extend themselves endlessly, often without realizing that they are disappearing in the process. They become everything for everyone, until there is very little left of themselves for themselves. But life does not allow this state to continue indefinitely, because what is unprotected cannot remain intact forever. The emotional world eventually becomes too heavy to carry without structure, and so the empath begins to experience exhaustion that no rest can fix. They begin to feel resentment where there was once only generosity. They begin to notice that their kindness is expected but not reciprocated, and in these moments of quiet suffering, something begins to shift deep within them. They do not become less compassionate. That is not the transformation. Instead, they begin to see more clearly where their compassion is being received and where it is being consumed. This is the beginning of boundaries, not as walls built out of anger, but as awareness born from pain. They begin to understand that not every emotional burden is theirs to carry. Not every problem requires their sacrifice. Not every person deserves unlimited access to their inner world. At first, this realization feels unnatural. The empath struggles with guilt. Saying no feels like betrayal. Pulling back feels like abandonment. Protecting their peace feels like selfishness. But life continues to show them again and again that overextension leads not to love being preserved, but to love being depleted. And slowly, through experience rather than theory, they begin to understand a deeper truth. Without boundaries, even the purest heart becomes a place of exhaustion. So they begin to change, not suddenly, but deliberately. They start to pause before responding. They start to observe before engaging. They start to ask themselves whether their presence is being valued or merely used. And in this space of reflection, something powerful begins to form, a sense of inner authority. They stop allowing emotional urgency from others to override their own emotional stability. And this is where their real strength begins to emerge. Because a boundless heart is not necessarily a strong heart. It is a vulnerable one. But a heart that has learned discernment becomes something entirely different. It still feels deeply, but it no longer bleeds unnecessarily. It still cares, but it no longer abandons itself in the process of caring for others. There is a quiet power in learning that love does not require self-erasure. That compassion does not require self-neglect. That understanding others does not mean losing oneself in them. The empath begins to realize that boundaries are not a rejection of love, but a refinement of it. They allow love to exist without distortion, without resentment, without exhaustion. And so what once made them vulnerable becomes the very thing that makes them stable. The same heart that once opened too easily now opens wisely. The same soul that once gave without limit now gives with clarity. And in this transformation, something profound takes place. They stop surviving their relationships and start choosing them. This is the quiet power of pain when it is finally understood. It does not harden the empath. It shapes them into something far more enduring, far more conscious, and far more complete. There is a stage in the life of an empath that the outside world often misunderstands, and the empath themselves struggles to interpret. It is the stage where connections begin to fade, where familiar faces feel distant, and where conversations that once felt meaningful begin to feel empty. They are not rejected by life, nor abandoned by others in the way they fear. Instead, they are slowly being drawn inward, away from noise, away from surface-level exchanges, and away from everything that no longer resonates with their evolving inner state. At first, this withdrawal feels like isolation. The empath may interpret it as loneliness, as if something has gone wrong in their life. They may question why they no longer fit into the same circles, why they feel misunderstood even in the presence of others, and why conversations that once excited them now feel like repetition without depth. But what they do not yet see is that this separation is not punishment. It is refinement. Life has a quiet way of removing external noise when it intends to reveal something internal. And for the empath, this silence becomes the beginning of something far more important than social belonging. It becomes the beginning of self-discovery. When the outer world stops providing constant stimulation, the inner world finally has space to speak. And for the first time, the empath begins to hear themselves without interruption. In this solitude, something subtle but powerful begins to unfold. The empath starts to notice thoughts they had previously ignored. They begin to feel emotions that were always present, but never acknowledged. They start questioning not just others, but themselves. Who am I when I am not absorbing the emotions of those around me? Who am I when I am not responding, not adapting, not adjusting to the needs of others? These questions, though unsettling at first, open the door to deeper awareness. And slowly, the empath begins to realize that solitude is not emptiness. It is clarity in disguise. In the absence of external voices, their own voice becomes clearer. In the absence of constant emotional exchange, their own emotional patterns become visible. They begin to understand their fears, their attachments, their triggers, and their desires with a level of honesty that was impossible in the noise of constant interaction. This is where self-mastery begins, not in control of the world, but in understanding of the self. The empath starts to recognize that much of their previous suffering did not come from life itself, but from unexamined reactions to life. They begin to see how often they lost themselves in the emotions of others, how often they confused responsibility with over-involvement, and how often they abandoned their own center in an attempt to maintain harmony outside of themselves. In solitude, they begin to rebuild that center, not quickly and not without discomfort, but steadily. They learn to sit with their own emotions without needing to escape them. They learn to observe their thoughts without immediately acting on them. They learn that silence is not emptiness, but a mirror reflecting back everything that was previously avoided. And in this mirror, clarity begins to form. The chaos that once lived in their emotional world starts to organize itself into understanding. Past experiences begin to make sense not as isolated events, but as patterns. Relationships are no longer seen through the lens of confusion, but through the lens of learning. Even pain begins to transform into insight, revealing what was never understood in the moment it was experienced. There is a deep transformation that occurs when a person is no longer running from themselves. The empath, in their solitude, begins to develop a kind of inner stability that does not depend on external validation or constant emotional connection. They stop seeking themselves in others and begin to find themselves within. And what emerges from this process is not loneliness, but strength. A quiet, grounded strength that does not need attention to exist. A clarity that does not require agreement to remain steady. A sense of self that is no longer easily dissolved by the emotions of the surrounding world. This is the hidden gift of their isolation. It is not the absence of connection, but the restoration of inner alignment. And once this alignment is discovered, the empath never returns to their previous confusion in the same way again. They may re-enter the world, they may reconnect with others, but they will do so from a place that is no longer fragmented. Because once a person has met themselves in silence and survived it, they are no longer lost in the noise of life. They are anchored within it. There comes a final stage in the unfolding of an empath's inner development, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood of all. After sensitivity has been refined, after boundaries have been formed, and after solitude has revealed the self, something deeper begins to emerge. It is the realization that emotion is not meant to be merely endured. It is meant to be transformed. And this transformation marks the difference between a life lived in emotional reaction and a life lived in emotional mastery. At the beginning, the empath experiences emotion as something that happens to them. It arrives without permission, moves through them without structure, and often leaves them drained. They absorb joy, but they also absorb sorrow. They absorb hope, but also despair. It feels as though they are not separate from the emotional world, but completely entangled within it. And for a long time, they believe this is simply who they are, open, sensitive, and permanently affected by the inner states of others. But life, through experience and repetition, begins to teach them something more profound. It shows them that emotion is not only something to receive, but something to interpret, not something to drown in, but something to understand. And once this shift begins, everything changes. The empath starts to notice that emotion carries information. Pain is not only suffering, it is communication. Joy is not only pleasure, it is direction. Even confusion is not meaningless, it is a signal that something within needs attention. This is where transformation begins, not in the absence of feeling, but in the awareness of what feeling is trying to reveal. The empath slowly stops asking, "Why do I feel this so deeply?" and begins asking, "What is this emotion trying to show me?" This single shift turns emotional chaos into emotional language. What was once overwhelming becomes readable. What was once heavy becomes meaningful. And in this understanding, a new capacity is born, the ability to channel emotion instead of being consumed by it. The empath begins to realize that their depth of feeling is not a burden to suppress, but a force to direct. The same intensity that once created inner turbulence can now become creativity, expression, and influence. Emotion, when no longer resisted, becomes energy. And energy, when understood, becomes purpose. They begin to notice this in subtle ways at first. A conversation that once left them drained now becomes insight for understanding human nature. A personal experience of pain becomes the foundation for empathy toward others who suffer in similar ways. Even their silence begins to carry weight, not as emptiness, but as presence. They are no longer just reacting to the world, they are interpreting it, shaping meaning from it, and offering that meaning back in forms that others can feel and understand. There is a profound shift that takes place here. The empath stops identifying with emotion as something that defines them and starts recognizing it as something that moves through them. They are not anger, they experience anger. They are not sadness, they move through sadness. And in this separation, freedom begins to appear. Not freedom from emotion, but freedom within emotion. With this freedom comes responsibility, because once emotion is understood, it can no longer be carelessly expressed. The empath begins to become aware of impact. They understand that their words carry emotional weight, that their presence influences atmosphere, and that their understanding of others can either heal or harm depending on how it is used. This awareness turns them from passive feelers into conscious contributors to the emotional world around them. And in time, something even greater emerges. They begin to guide others, not by instruction, but by presence. People are drawn to them not because they speak the loudest, but because they understand the quietest. Not because they impose meaning, but because they reveal it. Their depth becomes a mirror in which others begin to recognize their own hidden emotions, their own unspoken struggles, and their own untapped strength. This is the final transformation, when emotion becomes purpose, when sensitivity becomes service, when inner depth becomes outer impact. The empath is no longer overwhelmed by life. They are interpreting it, translating it, and offering it back in a form that brings clarity to others who are still lost within it. And so what once felt like a curse becomes a calling. What once felt like emotional excess becomes emotional mastery. And what once seemed like vulnerability reveals itself as one of the most profound forms of strength a human being can carry. In the end, they discover that their deepest emotions were never meant to break them. They were meant to prepare them to become a source of understanding for others who are still learning how to feel.